Order. Order in this courtroom. Mr. Reed, your attorney has 30 seconds. Use them wisely. Marcus Reed stood at the defense table in a shirt still faintly smelling of engine grease, no matter how many times he'd washed it the night before. His hands, cracked at the knuckles, rested flat on the table, because if he let them hang at his sides, they would shake. Your Honor, opposing counsel wants this court to believe that a man who fixes transmissions for a living cannot provide stability for a 9-year-old girl. Marcus's attorney, Angela Reyes, was young, sharp, and visibly outmatched by the 3-lawyer team seated across the aisle in tailored suits. I'd like to remind the court that stability isn't measured by a job title. Ms. Reyes, opposing counsel interrupted. Your client works 40-plus hours a week under a car, comes home with oil under his fingernails, and lives in a 1-bedroom apartment above a laundromat. My client, Vanessa Reed, offers a 5-bedroom home, a live-in nanny, and a private school tuition already paid in full. I don't think we need a jury to see where a child's interests are best served. Somewhere behind Marcus, in the 3rd row of the gallery, his daughter Zoe sat between her grandmother and a court-appointed guardian ad litem, her small hands folded in her lap the way her father had taught her to do in church. She wasn't supposed to be watching, but 9-year-olds hear more than anyone gives them credit for, and she had already heard the word unfit used to describe her father 4 times that morning. Mr. Reed, Judge Eleanor Whitfield said, removing her glasses and rubbing the bridge of her nose, is there anything you'd like to say for yourself before I make a preliminary ruling on temporary custody? Marcus looked at his daughter. He looked at his ex-wife, sitting beside her new fiancé in a blazer that cost more than Marcus made in 2 weeks. And he looked at the judge, a woman who had no reason to believe there was more to him than what the paperwork said. Occupation, automotive technicien. Income, reported at $41,000 a year. Assets, 2011 pickup truck, 1 storage unit, a checking account with $6,200 in it. Everything in that file was true, and none of it was the whole truth. Your Honor, Marcus said, his voice steady even though his stomach wasn't. I've never once been late picking my daughter up from school. Not one time in 4 years. I know her teacher's name, her best friend's allergies, and the exact way she likes her eggs, which is scrambled soft with cheese only on Sundays, because that's the day we don't rush. I don't have a mansion. I have a couch that folds out in her bed when she stays with me, and a night light shaped like a dinosaur, because she said the dark in a new place feels different than the dark at home. I'm not asking this court to believe I have more than her mother. I'm asking this court to believe that what I have is enough, because it's real. The judge studied him for a long moment. In the back of the courtroom, a man in a gray suit who had said nothing all morning quietly closed a folder he had been holding and slipped it back into his briefcase. He was not on any witness list. Nobody in that room, including Marcus, knew who he was yet, or that the folder in his hands contained a stack of documents that would upend everything the court thought it understood about the mechanic in the wrinkled shirt. Have you ever been in a room where everyone had already decided who you were before you said a word? To understand how Marcus Reed ended up fighting for his own daughter in a courtroom, standing against a legal team that cost more per hour than he made in a week, you have to go back 9 years to a garage on the edge of Marion, Ohio, and a promise he made to a dying man who taught him everything he knew about engines, and one thing he never taught him: how to let people underestimate you and win anyway. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Marion, Ohio, isn't the kind of town that shows up in anyone's story unless something extraordinary happens in it. And for most of his life, nothing extraordinary happened to Marcus Reed. He grew up 2 streets over from Fulton Street Auto Repair, a squat cinder block building with a hand-painted sign and a single bay door that stuck halfway up every winter. His father, Walter Reed, had owned that shop for 31 years, and before that, Walter's father had owned it for 22. Marcus learned to change oil before he learned to drive. He learned to read a torque wrench before he learned algebra, and honestly, the torque wrench made more sense to him. There was something honest about an engine. It didn't lie to you. If something was wrong, it told you in noise, in smoke, in a smell that didn't belong. People weren't like that. People could smile at you for years and still be lying the entire time. Marcus wouldn't fully understand that lesson until much later, but the seeds of it were planted early, watching his father get quietly cheated by suppliers who assumed a black man running a small garage in a small town wouldn't check his invoices closely enough to catch it. "Check everything twice, son," Walter used to say, wiping his hands on a rag that never seemed to get clean. People will hand you a bad deal wrapped in a smile, and they'll do it faster if they think you're not smart enough to notice. Walter Reed was not a wealthy man by the time Marcus was 18, but he was a respected one, and respect, in a town like Marion, was its own kind of currency. When Walter died of a heart attack behind the counter of that shop on a Tuesday afternoon in October, half the town showed up to the funeral, including men who owed him money he'd never once asked them to pay back. Marcus was 23. He inherited the shop, the debt that came with it, and a single sealed envelope his father had left with his lawyer, to be opened only if certain conditions were met, conditions Marcus wouldn't understand for years. He put the envelope in a drawer and didn't think about it again for a long time, because there was a business to run, rent to make, and eventually a life to build. He met Vanessa Alcott at a diner 3 blocks from the shop, back when she was working her way through community college waiting tables on weekends. She had a laugh that filled up a room and an ambition that Marcus found magnetic because he didn't have much of it himself, not in the traditional sense. He wanted a paid-off shop, a family, Sunday dinners, and maybe a boat someday. Vanessa wanted more than Marion, Ohio, could offer, and for a few years, Marcus thought he wanted to give it to her. They married when Marcus was 26. Zoe was born 2 years later, on a Thursday in March. And Marcus would tell anyone who asked that the moment they put his daughter in his arms was the only moment in his life that felt bigger than fixing his father's shop. Vanessa finished her business degree, while Marcus ran the garage 7 days a week to cover tuition, childcare, and a mortgage on a small house they could barely afford. He never complained. He believed, the way his father had believed, that the work was the point. That providing was love, even when providing looked like grease-stained knuckles and a body that ached every night at 9 o'clock. What Marcus didn't know, what he wouldn't discover until the marriage was already coming apart, was that Vanessa had started measuring their life against a different scale entirely. The polished, filtered version of success she saw every day on the social media accounts of women she'd gone to school with. Women whose husbands wore suits instead of coveralls. Women who posted from beach houses instead of backyards. By the time Zoe turned 5, Vanessa had taken a job at a marketing firm in Columbus, a 40-minute commute each way, and something in her had shifted. She started coming home later. She started talking about Marcus's job differently, not with the pride she once had, but with something closer to embarrassment, especially around her new co-workers. "You could sell the shop," she said one night, staring at her phone instead of at him. "Do something bigger. You're smarter than a garage, Marcus." "I like the garage," Marcus said, and he meant it, though he didn't yet understand that liking something was no longer enough for the woman he'd married. 2 years later, Vanessa filed for divorce. She didn't cite an affair, or cruelty, or anything dramatic. On the paperwork, under reason, she'd written irreconcilable differences, which Marcus understood, privately, to mean he had stopped being who she wanted him to become. What neither of them could have predicted, sitting in a mediator's office dividing up furniture and a modest savings account, was that the sealed envelope Marcus's father had left him 9 years earlier, still unopened in a drawer in his apartment, held the answer to a question neither of them had ever thought to ask, what Walter Reed had actually built in the final decade of his life, quietly, patiently, and almost entirely off the books that anyone in Marion, Ohio, ever bothered to look at. The divorce was finalized when Zoe was 7. The custody arrangement, drafted quickly and without much conflict at the time, gave Vanessa primary residential custody and Marcus every other weekend, plus Wednesday dinners. Marcus didn't fight it. He told himself Zoe needed stability, and Vanessa, with her new corporate salary and her new house in a neighborhood with a name like a golf course, could offer a version of stability he genuinely believed was better for his daughter, even if it broke something inside him every time he dropped her off on Sunday evenings. He sold the family house. He moved into a one-bedroom apartment above a laundromat on Cherry Avenue, the kind of place where the radiator clanked all winter and the parking lot flooded every spring. And he kept running the shop, because the shop was the one thing in his life that had never once let him down. It was during one of those long, quiet nights, boxing up the last of his things from the house he no longer lived in, that Marcus found the envelope again, tucked in the back of a filing cabinet drawer he hadn't opened since his father's funeral. His name was written on the front in his father's handwriting, the same careful block letters Walter had used to label every part bin in the shop for 30 years. Marcus Reed. Open when you're ready to stop being afraid of more than you think you deserve. He sat on the floor of an empty house at 11 o'clock at night and opened it. Inside was a letter, 4 pages long, and a set of legal documents Marcus didn't fully understand at first glance. The letter explained everything. In the final decade of his life, Walter Reed, using savings, small investments, and a partnership with 2 other men he'd trusted since high school, had quietly purchased a controlling stake in a struggling regional auto dealership group headquartered 2 counties over, a company called Baldwin Motors, which at the time was on the verge of bankruptcy. Walter never told anyone in Marion. He never changed his life, never bought a bigger house, never stopped fixing transmissions 6 days a week, because, as he wrote in the letter, he didn't do it for the money. He did it because a group of men had once told him a black mechanic from Marion had no business owning anything bigger than a 2-bay garage, and Walter had spent the rest of his life quietly proving them catastrophically wrong, without ever once needing them to know it. By the time Walter died, that struggling dealership group had grown into a network of 11 dealerships across 3 states. Restructured under new leadership Walter had personally vetted and installed, generating tens of millions of dollars in annual revenue. Walter had structured his ownership through a private holding company, Reed Family Holdings, with instructions that Marcus would inherit full controlling interest the moment he chose to open the envelope, but not a day before, because Walter, in his final years, had come to believe something Marcus would spend the rest of that night reading over and over. If I hand this to you too soon, son, you'll never know if you could have built your own thing, and you'll always wonder. Better you find your feet first. When you're ready, this is yours. Use it to protect the people you love. Never let anyone in a courtroom, a boardroom, or a kitchen table look at your hands and think they know the size of what you're capable of. Marcus read the letter 4 times that night. He didn't sleep. In the morning, he called the number listed for the holding company's attorney, a man named Thomas Ferris who had been managing the arrangement quietly for 9 years, waiting for exactly this call. Mr. Reed, Ferris said, when I heard your father passed, I honestly didn't know if you'd ever open that envelope. Some men never do. They're too scared of what it means to be more than what people already decided about them. Marcus didn't tell Vanessa. He didn't tell anyone in Marion. He kept running Fulton Street Auto Repair with his own 2 hands every single day, and quietly, carefully, guided by Ferris and the board his father had built, he began learning the second half of the business his father had spent a decade constructing in silence. He restructured underperforming locations. He personally interviewed every general manager. He drove 2 hours after closing the shop, 3 nights a week, to sit in on dealership operations meetings under the name M. Reed, never once mentioning Fulton Street or the ex-wife or the daughter he was trying to hold on to through a custody schedule that gave him 96 hours a month. He told himself he was waiting for the right time to tell Zoe, to tell Vanessa, to tell anyone. He told himself there was no rush. What he didn't yet understand was that Vanessa's life, and her opinion of the man she'd left behind, was about to collide with his in a courtroom, and that the version of Marcus everyone in that courtroom would see, oil under his nails, a folded-out couch, a storage unit, was about to become the single greatest misjudgment of Vanessa Reed's life. 2 years after the divorce, Vanessa remarried. Her new husband, Preston Cole, was a corporate attorney 12 years older than her, recently made partner at a firm in Columbus, with 2 grown children from a previous marriage who mostly lived out of state. Preston was polished, confident, and, Marcus would later learn, deeply irritated by the fact that his new stepdaughter spent every other weekend with a man he privately referred to, at dinner parties, as the mechanic. It was Preston who first suggested, gently, then less gently, that the custody arrangement should be revisited. He didn't need to say it was about Zoe's well-being out loud for Vanessa to hear, that framing in every conversation. Sweetheart, don't you think a 9-year-old deserves more consistency? Don't you think it matters what school district she's in on weekends? What kind of home environment shapes her? I'm not saying Marcus is a bad father. I'm saying he's a limited one. Vanessa filed a motion to modify custody 4 months later, seeking to reduce Marcus's parenting time to supervised visitation only, citing, among other things, his housing situation, his income level, and what the petition called an inability to provide adequate educational and extracurricular support consistent with the child's established lifestyle. Marcus read the petition 3 times in his apartment above the laundromat, the same apartment the document cited as evidence of instability, and felt something in his chest go cold in a way it hadn't since his father's funeral. He hired Angela Reyes, a family law attorney 2 years out of her own practice, because she was the only lawyer in Marion who would take the case for a payment plan Marcus could actually afford. He did not, even then, touch a cent of Reed family holdings. Part of him wanted to prove to himself as much as anyone that he could fight for his daughter on his own terms first. Part of him, if he was honest, was still afraid of what it would mean to become the thing his father had quietly built, afraid of losing the version of himself that fixed transmissions with his own hands and knew every regular customer by name. In the weeks leading up to that first hearing, Marcus tried, in every way he knew how, to prepare Zoe without frightening her. He didn't tell her the word custody. He told her that sometimes grown-ups needed a judge to help them agree on a schedule, the way a referee helped 2 teams agree on the rules of a game. Zoe, sharp for her age, asked if the judge would ask her who she wanted to live with, and Marcus, not wanting to lie to his daughter, told her the truth, that the judge might talk to her at some point, and that whatever she said, there was no wrong answer, because both her parents loved her, and nothing she said could ever change that. He didn't sleep well those weeks. He'd lie awake in the apartment above the laundromat, listening to the dryers thump through the floor until midnight, running numbers in his head that had nothing to do with engines. How much a lawyer cost, how much a missed mortgage payment on the shop would set him back, whether the judge would see a mechanic's schedule as dedication or as a red flag. He never once, in those sleepless nights, thought about the envelope in the drawer. That door, in his mind, had been closed for good the day he sold the family house and told himself he'd build his daughter's life with his own 2 hands, the same way his father built the shop. The first hearing, the one that opened this story, did not go well. Preston's firm had assigned Vanessa a team of 3 attorneys, led by a sharp litigator named Deborah Okonkwo-Hale, who specialized in exactly this kind of case. Wealthy remarried parent versus working-class biological parent, a pattern she had successfully argued a dozen times before. She built her case with surgical precision, framing every fact about Marcus's life, his apartment, his income, his 60-hour work weeks, as evidence not of a hard-working father, but of a man who could not offer stability. Judge Eleanor Whitfield, a careful, soft-spoken woman 11 years on the family court bench, did not rule that day. She ordered a temporary custody evaluation, appointed a guardian ad litem to interview Zoe, and scheduled a full hearing for 6 weeks later. In the meantime, Marcus's parenting time was reduced on a temporary basis to supervised weekend visits only, a decision that broke something in him he wasn't sure would ever fully heal. He drove home from that first hearing and sat in his truck outside the shop for 40 minutes without going inside. Then he pulled out his phone and called Thomas Ferris for the first time in 8 months. "I need to talk to you about the holding company," Marcus said. "I think it's time." Ferris was quiet on the other end of the line for a moment. "Marcus," he finally said, "I've been waiting 2 years for this call, and I want you to know whatever you decide to do with what your father built, I'll support it. But I need you to be sure. Once this becomes part of a court record, it's public in a way it's never been before. Your privacy, the quiet your father built this on purpose, that's gone the moment you file it." "I know," Marcus said, watching a truck rumble past the shop's front window in the dark. "But I've been sitting here thinking my daughter is going to grow up believing a judge decided her father wasn't good enough, and that's a lie I'm not willing to let stand, even if the truth costs me the privacy my dad worked 31 years to protect." That night, after hanging up with Ferris, Marcus sat at his father's old workbench in the back of the shop, the one piece of furniture he'd refused to sell or replace, and ran his thumb over the initials WR carved into the corner of it decades earlier. For the first time since he'd read that letter, he understood it wasn't really about the money at all. His father hadn't built Reed Family Holdings to make Marcus rich. He'd built it as a door, one Marcus could choose to walk through the moment he needed it for something bigger than himself. Zoe was at something bigger. Understand something about Marcus Reed in this moment. He did not call Ferris because he suddenly wanted to be rich or because he wanted to win a courtroom fight by flexing a bank account he'd kept hidden for 2 years. He called because he had spent 6 weeks watching a legal team paint him as unfit using nothing but the truth of his income and address. And he had finally understood something his father tried to teach him in that letter. Sometimes protecting the people you love means letting go of the fear of being seen as more than what people assumed. But it was more complicated than simply walking into the next hearing and announcing he owned 11 dealerships. Reed Family Holdings was structured by Walter's design to be extremely private, layered through the holding company specifically so that no one, including business partners, journalists, or a nosy small town, could easily trace Marcus Reed the mechanic Tim, Reed the majority owner. Unwinding that privacy, verifying it in a way a family court would accept as legitimate documentation and not some elaborate fabrication, would take time, forensic accountants, and sworn affidavits from Ferris and the dealership group's board. Angela Reyes, when Marcus finally told her the truth in her small office above a bakery, sat in stunned silence for nearly a full minute. "You're telling me," she said slowly, "that you have been eating ramen for 2 years and taking on a $400 an hour legal team while sitting on a controlling stake in an 11 dealership auto group." "I didn't want it to be about money," Marcus said. "I wanted to be your father because I show up, not because of what's in an account somewhere." "Marcus," Angela said, leaning forward, "that account isn't the point anymore. It's evidence. It's proof of exactly the kind of stability they're accusing you of not having. This isn't about pride at this point. This is about your daughter." Ferris flew in from Columbus the following week with a binder of documentation. Ownership records, tax filings under the holding company, board meeting minutes with Marcus's signature on them dated back nearly 2 years, bank statement from an account entirely separate from the one listed in the custody filing. It was airtight, verifiable, and utterly unlike anything Deborah Okonkwo-Hale would be expecting from the mechanic across the aisle. But Angela made a decision that surprised even Ferris. She didn't want to simply drop the documentation on the court like a bomb designed for shock value. Judges did not respond well to theatrics, and Judge Whitfield, in particular, had a reputation for distrusting anything that felt like a performance. Instead, Angela built a case, methodically, over the following weeks, establishing first through witnesses, teachers, neighbors, the guardian ad litem's own interviews with Zoe, that Marcus's day-to-day parenting, regardless of income, was exceptional. She wanted the court to fall in love with the father before they ever learned about the dealerships, so that when the truth came out, it would read not as a reversal, but as confirmation of something the court should have already suspected, that a man who showed up every single day for his daughter was never, in any sense that mattered, unstable. Meanwhile, at home, Marcus had a harder conversation to have, one that had nothing to do with courtrooms. He sat Zoe down on a Wednesday evening on the folded-out couch that doubled as her bed and told her, in the gentlest language he could find, that her grandfather had left something behind, something Marcus had been keeping quiet, and that things might look a little different soon. "Are we going to be rich, Daddy?" Zoe asked, with the blunt curiosity only a 9-year-old could manage. "We're not going to be different," Marcus said. "I'm still going to fix cars if I want to. I'm still going to make your eggs soft on Sundays. This isn't about changing who we are. It's about making sure nobody gets to tell a judge that who we are isn't enough." Zoe considered this with the seriousness of a much older person, then asked the question that would end up, unknowingly, becoming the emotional center of the entire case. "Mom's lawyer said you don't have enough to give me a good life. Is that true?" Marcus knelt down in front of his daughter, in an apartment above a laundromat that a courtroom had called inadequate, and told her the truest thing he knew. "Baby, nobody can give you a good life with money alone. I give you a good life every single day I show up. The money's just going to make sure nobody gets to take those days away from us again. The full custody hearing convened on a gray Tuesday morning in late October, almost exactly 1 year after Walter Reed had died, though Marcus didn't consciously register the anniversary until he was already seated at the defense table, his father's watch, the one thing of Walter's he still wore every day, cool against his wrist. Deborah Okonkwo-Hale opened confidently, walking the court through 6 weeks of accumulated evidence. Marcus's income statements, his apartment lease, a chart, actually printed and mounted on foam board, comparing square footage between Marcus's apartment and Vanessa's 5-bedroom home. She called an expert witness, a child development consultant, who testified in careful, clinical language about the correlation between household stability and long-term outcomes for children of divorce. Angela did not object much. She let the financial narrative play out fully, almost inviting it, which visibly unsettled Deborah, who had expected more resistance. When it was Angela's turn, she didn't start with Marcus's finances at all. She started with Zoe's kindergarten teacher, who testified that Marcus had never missed a single parent-teacher conference in 5 years, including one he attended 40 minutes after closing the shop, still in his work clothes, because he refused to reschedule. She called Zoe's current 4th-grade teacher, who described a little girl who spoke about her father with unmistakable warmth and security. She called the guardian ad litem, whose report noted that Zoe, when asked where she felt safest, answered without hesitation, "At Daddy's, because he lets me help with the light stuff in the garage, and he always listens all the way before he talks." The courtroom's mood had visibly shifted by the time Angela called her final witness of the day. Judge Whitfield, watching closely, had begun making notes with a different energy than she had during the morning's financial testimony. "Your Honor," Angela said, "I'd like to submit an additional set of exhibits into evidence, along with the sworn testimony of Mr. Thomas Ferris, legal counsel for Reed Family Holdings." Deborah Okonkwo-Hale's head turned sharply. "Objection, Your Honor. This witness and these exhibits were not on the disclosed list. They were disclosed to opposing counsel 8 days ago, within the required window," Angela said calmly, "and I'd remind the court that Ms. Hale's office confirmed receipt in writing." Judge Whitfield reviewed the filing herself, her expression unreadable, before nodding once. "Proceed, Ms. Reyes." Thomas Ferris took the stand in a gray suit, the same man who had sat silently in the gallery during the very first hearing, closing a folder no one thought to ask about. He explained methodically and without embellishment the structure of Reed Family Holdings, the history of Walter Reed's decade-long, deliberately private investment in what was now an 11-dealership regional auto group, and Marcus's position for the past 2 years as majority controlling owner and increasingly active operator, sitting on quarterly strategy calls, personally approving executive hires, restructuring underperforming locations, all while continuing to run Fulton Street Auto Repair with his own hands 6 days a week. Somewhere in the third row, Zoe's grandmother, Marcus's mother, pressed a hand to her mouth. She had known about the envelope, had watched her husband write that letter years earlier, and had never once told her son what was inside it, honoring Walter's wish that Marcus find it in his own time. She had waited 9 years to see this exact moment, and she hadn't allowed herself to believe it would ever actually arrive. The gallery had gone completely silent. Vanessa, seated beside Preston, had gone pale in a way Marcus had never once seen in 11 years of marriage. Preston leaned toward his wife and whispered something Marcus couldn't hear. But whatever it was, Vanessa pulled her arm away from him, just slightly, a small motion that would mean more in the weeks to come than anyone in that courtroom yet understood. "Mr. Ferris," Angela asked, "can you tell the court the approximate combined annual revenue of the dealerships under Reed Family Holdings controlling ownership?" "Last fiscal year, just under $62 million, Ferris said. "And Mr. Reed's personal financial position? Conservatively, in the range of 9 figures in controlling equity, though Mr. Reed has drawn only a modest personal salary and has reinvested the majority of distributions back into the company and a private trust established for his daughter's education and future, which was funded in full 18 months ago." Judge Whitfield removed her glasses again, the same gesture from the very first hearing, but this time, Her expression carried something closer to disbelief than fatigue. "Mr. Reed," she said, addressing Marcus directly for the first time all day, "why did none of this appear anywhere in your original financial disclosures?" Marcus stood, his hands steady now in a way they hadn't been in that first hearing. "Because, Your Honor, when this started, I genuinely believed I could win the right to raise my daughter on the strength of showing up every single day, not on the size of a bank account. I still believe that should be enough in a fair world. It became clear to me over the last 6 weeks that this court was being asked to decide my daughter's home based on assumptions about a man in a mechanic's uniform, and I decided my daughter's future wasn't worth protecting my own pride about how I wanted to win this. Have you ever watched a room full of people recalculate everything they thought they understood about a person in real time in the space of a single answer?" During the recess, Marcus stepped out into the courthouse hallway alone, needing air more than anything. He found Zoe's grandmother waiting by the water fountain, and for a long moment neither of them said anything at all. Then she pulled him into a hug the way she used to when he was a boy who'd skinned his knee, and told him something he would remember for the rest of his life. "Your father used to say the same thing about you that you just said about Zoe," she told him, her voice thick. "He said, that boy doesn't need to be handed anything. He just needs someone to stop standing in his light long enough to let people see him. I think today, for the first time, they finally saw you, Marcus. Really saw you." Marcus stood in that hallway, in a suit he'd bought secondhand for the first hearing and never replaced, and let himself cry for the first time since his father's funeral, not out of relief, not yet, because the ruling hadn't come, but out of the sheer exhaustion of having spent 2 years being seen as less than he was, and finally, for one afternoon, letting the truth stand in the room without flinching. Deborah Okonkwo-Hale requested a recess. When the hearing resumed 90 minutes later, her posture, her tone, and her strategy had all visibly shifted, because everything her case had been built on, that Marcus Reed was financially unstable, professionally limited, and unable to offer Zoe the life her mother could, had just been dismantled by sworn testimony and a stack of forensic documentation that Ferris's team had spent 6 weeks quietly assembling. She pivoted, as skilled litigators do, attempting to reframe the revelation itself as a character issue. "Your Honor, if anything, this deception, concealing a 9-figure business interest from this court, from his own daughter for 2 years, from his ex-wife entirely, speaks to exactly the kind of instability and dishonesty this court should be concerned about. What kind of father hides something like this?" It was a sharp pivot, and for a moment, Marcus felt the ground shift under him again. But Judge Whitfield, who had spent 11 years on that bench learning to distinguish real concealment from real humility, asked a question that would end up defining the rest of the hearing. "Mr. Reed," she said, "why didn't you use this money to make your custody case easier from the beginning? You could have hired the best attorneys in the state the day the petition was filed. Why didn't you?" Marcus thought about his father, about a letter written in careful block handwriting, about a man who spent 31 years quietly proving people wrong without ever once needing them to know it. "Because I wanted my daughter to grow up believing her father earned things, Your Honor, not bought them. Because my father built something remarkable by staying quiet and letting his work speak first. I think I was trying to live up to that, even in the middle of the hardest fight of my life. Maybe that was pride. Maybe it was fear. But it was never dishonesty toward my daughter. She's known everything, on her level, for months now. The only people who didn't know were the people trying to prove I wasn't enough." Vanessa, called briefly back to the stand for cross-examination, was asked directly by Angela whether her original petition and its emphasis on Marcus's income and housing would have been filed the same way if she had known about Reed family holdings from the beginning. "I don't know," Vanessa admitted, her voice smaller than it had been at any point in the proceedings. Preston felt strongly that Zoe needed more stability than Marcus could offer. "I believe him." "And do you believe," Angela asked gently, "that Marcus has ever, in 9 years of co-parenting, failed to show up for Zoe in a way that actually mattered to her?" The courtroom waited. Vanessa looked for the first time in the entire hearing directly at Marcus, not at Preston, not at her attorney, at the man she had once loved enough to marry in a small church 2 towns over from Marion. No, she said quietly. He's never once failed to show up. Before the recess, the guardian ad litem, a soft-spoken woman named Rita Alvarez who had spent 3 weeks observing both households, was called to summarize her written report for the record, since much of it had, until that point, only been reviewed privately by the judge. She described visiting Marcus's apartment above the laundromat unannounced on a Tuesday evening and finding Zoe at the kitchen table doing homework while Marcus made dinner, describing the two of them working through a fraction problem together. Marcus using a socket wrench and a set of bolts from the shop to physically demonstrate what a fraction actually meant, because Zoe had said the textbook explanation didn't make sense to her. He didn't know I was still there when he did that, Alvarez told the court. He wasn't performing for anyone. That's simply how he teaches her things. I've done this job for 14 years, and I don't often see the kind of unself-conscious patience in either household I visit, regardless of income. She also described her visit to Vanessa and Preston's home, careful to note it was, by every material measure, a beautiful and comfortable environment, before adding a detail that visibly affected the judge more than any financial document had. She noted that Zoe kept a small shoebox under her bed at her mother's house, and when Alvarez asked what was inside it, Zoe showed her ticket stubs from a county fair, a pressed 4-leaf clover, and a folded drawing of a car with the words Daddy's Shop written across the top in a child's handwriting, dated nearly 2 years earlier. She told me that box was her favorite thing in that whole house, Alvarez said quietly. Not because of what was in it, but because it was the only thing in there that was entirely, completely hers. Judge Whitfield did not rule that day. She took the matter under advisement for 8 days, reviewing the guardian ad litem's full report, the financial documentation, and a private in-chambers conversation with Zoe herself, conducted without either parent present, at the child's own request, which surprised everyone in the courtroom except, perhaps, Zoe. Marcus spent those 8 days the same way he'd spent every day for the previous 2 years, opening Fulton Street Auto Repair at 7 in the morning, changing oil, replacing brake pads, closing up at 6, and driving to whatever supervised visitation slot the temporary order allowed him that week. He did not buy a bigger house. He did not quit the shop. Ferris, half joking, suggested Marcus at least trade in the truck for something newer, and Marcus laughed for the first time in weeks and told him the truck ran fine and he wasn't in the business of fixing things that weren't broken. On the 8th day, the court reconvened. Judge Whitfield's ruling was longer than either party expected and unusually personal for a family court decision, though Marcus would later understand why. In 11 years on this bench, she began, I have seen a great number of custody cases built around the false premise that a parent's income is a reliable measure of a parent's love or a parent's capability. I want to be direct about something. If Mr. Reed's financial position had never come to light in this hearing, based solely on the testimony of teachers, the guardian ad litem's report, and this child's own words about where she feels safest, I would have ruled substantially in his favor regardless. The revelation of Reed Family Holdings does not change my assessment of Mr. Reed as a father. It only confirms what should never have required confirmation, that a man's capacity to provide has never been measured by the state of his fingernails. The court restored Marcus's original parenting schedule in full, expanded it to reflect additional holiday and summertime given Zoe's own stated wishes during their private conversation, and, in a rare move, included a formal note in the ruling criticizing the original petition's heavy reliance on socioeconomic framing as, in the court's words, exactly the kind of bias this system must actively guard against. Vanessa did not appeal. Preston, according to people who still talked around Marion, quietly stopped attending family court functions on Vanessa's behalf altogether after that. 6 months later, Marcus still opened Fulton Street Auto Repair at 7 every morning. He still made Zoe's eggs soft with cheese on Sundays, still kept the dinosaur night light plugged in on the nights she stayed with him, even though she'd recently, gently, informed him she was getting a little old for it and he could probably retire it soon, a sentence that broke his heart a little in the good way. He had, at Ferris's persistent urging, finally moved out of the apartment above the laundromat, into a modest house with a real backyard, not because a courtroom told him he needed to, but because Zoe had asked, shyly, if they could maybe get a dog someday, and a dog needed a yard. He kept the truck. He kept the shop, though he'd since promoted his longest-serving mechanic to run daily operations so he could spend 2 afternoons a week involved in the dealership group. Work he found, to his own surprise, he didn't hate. At Reed Family Holdings' annual company gathering that spring, Marcus stood at a podium in front of employees from 11 dealerships across 3 states, most of whom had never once met the man behind the majority ownership, and told them, briefly, the story his father had never told anyone. A mechanic from a 2-bay garage in Marion, Ohio, who spent 31 years being underestimated by every supplier, every bank loan officer, every man in a nicer suit who assumed his hands couldn't hold anything bigger than a wrench, and who built something enormous in total silence rather than argue with people who'd already made up their minds. My father used to tell me, check everything twice, because people will hand you a bad deal wrapped in a smile if they think you're not smart enough to notice, Marcus told the room. I think what he was really teaching me was this. Let people underestimate you if they need to. Just don't let their underestimation become your ceiling. Zoe, 10 years old now, sat in the front row that day, swinging her feet on her folding chair, watching her father speak in front of a room full of adults who had all, in one way or another, once assumed they knew exactly what kind of man he was. Afterward, walking to the truck in a parking lot, Zoe slipped her hand into her father's grease-stained one, the same hand that had signed board resolutions worth tens of millions of dollars that same afternoon. Daddy, she said, are you still going to fix cars, even though you're kind of a big deal now? Marcus laughed, the real laugh, the one that used to fill up the whole garage. Baby, he said, I was always a big deal. Nobody just knew where to look. What Marcus Reed learned, in the hardest year of his life, wasn't really about money at all. It was about the quiet, dangerous mistake people make every single day, looking at a person's hands, their apartment, their job title, and believing they've seen the whole picture, when the truest measure of a father, of anyone, was never visible on paper at all. It was in every Wednesday dinner never missed, every soft scrambled Sunday egg, every single time he showed up, not because a court required it, but because that was simply who Marcus Reed had always been, long before anyone in that courtroom knew what he was truly worth. 2 years after the ruling, Fulton Street Auto Repair got a new sign, hand-painted, the same way Walter Reed's original sign had been decades earlier, except this one had a small line added underneath the shop's name. EST 1974, family-owned, still fixing things that matter. Marcus still worked the counter 3 days a week, though he'd long since stopped needing to, because the truth, the one he'd tried to explain to a courtroom full of strangers, was that he had never once been chasing money. He'd been protecting a version of fatherhood he refused to let anyone put a price tag on, and it turned out that same stubbornness was exactly what had made Reed Family Holdings successful in the first place. Patience, integrity, and a refusal to cut corners just because no one was watching. Vanessa and Marcus, in time, found something neither of them expected, a working peace. It wasn't friendship, not exactly, but it was respect, hard-earned and honest, forged in the aftermath of a courtroom that had forced both of them to confront who they really were when everything was on the line. Vanessa later told a mutual friend, in a moment of rare candor, that the hardest part of the entire ordeal wasn't losing the case. It was realizing she had let someone else's voice convince her that the man she once chose to marry, the man who had never once failed their daughter, wasn't enough. Preston and Vanessa's marriage did not survive the following year, though that is, as they say, a different story entirely. Zoe, now 12, still keeps a shoebox under her bed, though it's a bigger box now, and it holds different things. A photo from her father's company gathering, a birthday card signed by mechanics from 3 different states, and a small drawing, redone and reframed, of a car with the words Daddy's Shop written across the top because some things, Zoe had decided, were worth keeping no matter how much everything else around them changed. Marcus Reed never set out to teach anyone a lesson. But if you ask people in Marion, Ohio, what they remember about the mechanic who turned out to own half the dealerships in 3 states, they won't tell you about the money. They'll tell you about a man who was in that shop every single morning at 7 o'clock, grease under his nails, exactly the way he'd always been, because being underestimated, Marcus had learned, was never actually a problem to solve. It was simply a door other people were choosing not to open, and he had long since stopped waiting for their permission to walk through it. If this story moved you, we'd love to know. Do you think Marcus was wrong to hide his wealth for 2 years, even to protect his daughter? Or was he right to let his character speak first? Tell us in the comments below. We read every single one. And let us know where you're watching from tonight. If you believe every parent deserves to be judged by their love, not their paycheck, hit that subscribe button so you never miss the next story from the unreliable narrator.